I never thought my life would unravel in the quiet of my son's living room. The words slipped from my mouth almost gently, yet they landed like an explosion. I refuse to pay $50,000 for your cruise, Lilia. My daughter-in-law's face twisted into something cruel, her manicured fingers crumpling the glossy brochure she had been flaunting. David, my only son, sat frozen on the couch, his eyes darting between us. But I already knew which side he would choose. He always chose her. Lilia stood, her tall frame looming above me, her voice dripping ice. "This isn't a request, Marlene." I kept my voice steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. I understood perfectly, and the answer is no. The sharp crack of her palm against my cheek echoed through the room like a gunshot. Heat spread across my face, and before I could even process it, she screamed, "Then find somewhere else to live." I turned to David, waiting for him to defend me, but he only nodded, his voice low and almost apologetic. "Maybe it's time you found your own place, Mom." The betrayal hit harder than the slap. I had raised him alone after his father left when he was 3, working double shifts at the diner, pouring every ounce of myself into giving him a chance at a better life. Now, he looked at me like a burden. I reminded them that I'd paid rent for 2 years, contributed to groceries, helped with utilities, even the down payment on David's car. Lilia only laughed, mocking my $800 a month as nothing compared to David's 6-figure salary. If it was so little, why did they need my savings for their trip? "Because we deserve it," David said flatly, his eyes hardening with resentment I had never seen before. Lilia sneered, accusing me of hoarding money, asking what a lonely 62-year-old with no friends or life needed it for. Her words pierced deeper than I wanted to admit. Over the years, she had isolated me, cutting me off from friends, keeping me in her house, but never truly letting me belong. When I refused again, David stood and delivered the final blow. "Then I'll need every penny from you, $50,000, and whatever else you've saved. Consider it repayment for everything we've done." My hands trembled as I carried 2 suitcases and a box of photo albums down the stairs. I paused at the door, listening to Lilia on the phone, bragging to her mother that I had agreed to move out and would even pay for their cruise as a parting gift. David didn't even come to see me off. I loaded my old Honda with the sum of my life and drove into the night with no destination. For days, I slept in parking lots, curled in the back seat, eating cheap meals at diners, counting the money I had left. $87,000. Not a fortune, but it represented decades of labor-aching feet and sleepless nights. I realized then that I hadn't been building a life. I'd been building a prison, one made of guilt and obligation. On the 4th morning, I wandered to the harbor. The sound of gulls, the sight of the sun glinting off the water, reminded me of younger years when life had felt full of possibilities. That's when I saw him, silver hair, crisp captain's uniform, standing tall on the deck of a cruise ship. James Morrison, my first love. I hadn't seen him since 1983, but I would have recognized that profile anywhere. He spotted me immediately, his smile breaking across his face as he came down the gangway. "Marlene Patterson," he called. Hearing my maiden name brought tears to my eyes. "It's Cooper now," I said softly, though even that felt uncertain after what had happened with David. He reached me, still tall and strong, lines of experience etched into his face, but kindness shining in his eyes. "You look like you could use a good meal," he said gently. He invited me aboard his ship, the Sea Star, and for the first time in days, someone spoke to me with warmth instead of demands. Over steaming mugs of coffee in his quarters, I told him everything: the years of sacrifice, the cruelty of my daughter-in-law, the betrayal of my son, the nights spent in my car. James listened silently, then said words that struck me like a revelation. Marlene, that's elder abuse. I wanted to protest, but he laid it out plainly. They had exploited me, taken nearly $100,000 over the years, and when I refused, they made me homeless. He asked me what I planned to do now, and I admitted I had no answer. But James did. He revealed he was part owner of the cruise line Morrison Maritime, and that he wanted me to join him not just as staff, but as a partner overseeing guest services. The offer seemed impossible, but he reminded me of what I had spent my life doing: customer service, managing tight budgets, solving impossible problems with limited resources. He told me those skills were exactly what the company needed. And then softly, he admitted he had never stopped caring about me, that one of his greatest regrets was letting me walk away 40 years ago. For the first time in decades, I felt something stirring inside me. Hope. Possibility. Maybe even the faint glimmer of love. I said yes. James moved quickly, but he moved with care, as if he knew I needed structure as much as rescue. The next morning at 9:00 a.m., he walked me into a glass building that overlooked the harbor, past framed photos of ships cutting white wakes through impossible blue water, and introduced me to a team that treated me not as a favor, but as a colleague. He handed me a temporary badge and a notebook, then set me at a conference table with a syllabus he had written himself: guest services standards, safety protocols, escalation paths, port logistics, vendor contracts, staffing ratios, and the subtle art of smoothing a storm before anyone on board knows a cloud exists. I recognized the rhythm immediately. In another life, I had memorized menu rotations and supplier quirks. I had calmed irate customers while calculating tips and double-checking kitchen tickets. This was the same work in a different uniform, people pressure, and a clock that never stopped. By 2:00 p.m., I was shadowing the vice president of hotel operations through a walkthrough of provisioning and linen inventory. I learned that pillows had specs, that towels had lifespans, that a jar of olives could derail a wedding reception if a vendor missed a pallet. I discovered a part of myself I had mislaid in other people's houses. I was good at seeing around corners. When a spreadsheet revealed a pattern of guest complaints about embarkation queues on Caribbean routes, I suggested switching the welcome flute of sparkling wine to a later deck party and reassigning 5 hosts to security checkpoints during peak windows. Small pivots, large results. The vice president raised an eyebrow at James that said quietly, "She is the real thing." At 6:30 p.m., he took me to dinner at a little place with white paper on the tables and basil warm in the air. We did not talk about pity or debt. We talked about systems. We talked about a company. He said, "You will not be a mascot. If you come in with authority." 3 weeks passed in a firm, steady gale. I rose at 6:00 a.m., read manuals with coffee until 7:30 a.m., met department heads at 9:00 a.m., rode tenders, toured galleys, watched drills, and wrote notes until my pencil left faint grooves in the page. In another life, I had kept a family fed on coupons. Here, those same calculations became fleet-wide cost control, without cruelty, efficiency, without cutting the humanity out of hospitality. When James said, "You're ready," it did not feel like kindness. It felt like accuracy. The legal day came with quiet ceremony. I sat in a lawyer's office with a view of cranes lifting containers, and I signed papers that made me a partner. My contribution was the same $50,000 I had refused to set on fire. I liked the poetry of it. Money that had once been demanded became an investment with returns. Ownership did not make me glamorous, it made me calm. With the partnership came title and scope guest services across 12 ship standards that would be mine to design and enforce accountability to the experience every traveler would carry home in memory. I moved into a company apartment with a view of the bay, hung my 2 best dresses in the closet, and let James bully me into tailoring a blazer that made my shoulders feel as strong as they had always had to be. In mirrors, I started recognizing the set of a woman's jaw that had learned to say no and mean it, Silence followed from the house I had left. No calls, no texts, no knock on the door to ask if I had eaten. Then, one Tuesday, at 3:10 p.m., David's name lit my phone, and the air thinned the way it does just before lightning. He said he had been trying to find me, that things had gotten out of hand, that we were stressed. He said Lilia's friend's startup had collapsed and taken $40,000 of their savings. He said the bank had muttered foreclosure, and the cruise line still expected payment on a booking. He said all of this in a flat voice that used to ask me for field trip money. I listened and felt the old reflex to patch and placate rise like a tide, and then recede. I told him I would not send them a penny. I told him that grown choices come with grown consequences. He threatened loneliness as if it were news. I thought of the ship's bridge at midnight and the way phosphorescence writes undiscovered alphabets in the dark. I said calmly that I was already alone and that I was doing fine. That would have been the end of it, except entitlement rarely settles quietly. A week later, our booking department flagged a reservation made on credit, a Mr. and Mrs. David Cooper Caribbean route on the Sea Star. I stared at the screen and felt something complicated settle in my chest, not vengeance and not fear. James came into my office, read the file over my shoulder, and did not flinch. "You don't have to be aboard," he said. "But if you want to see things clearly, clarity lives at sea." I understood immediately. He was not asking whether I wanted spectacle. He was asking whether I wanted data, a controlled experiment in power shifts and boundaries. I told him I wanted to be there. For 2 weeks, I lived aboard the Sea Star and learned her arteries. I watched embarkation flow from mezzanine vantage points, stood quietly at guest services, while people asked for extra keys and late checkouts, memorized the way sound bounces in the theater and how long it takes a housekeeping team to flip a suite after a family with toddlers. My badge bore my new name, Marlene Morrison, and the crew took it as fact, with the easy pragmatism of people who care more about whether you show up than what you are called. By the time embarkation morning arrived at 8:00 a.m., I had a plan that looked on paper like routine service. It was in fact an exercise in exacting mercy. I positioned myself near the guest services desk in a navy blazer with the company crest, reviewing a checklist I did not need. When they appeared, Lilia in a white dress that sparkled like ice, David hunched with that small, habitual tilt of a man who is always bracing, I felt no trembling. They approached the counter arguing about a cabin category they had not paid for. I stepped forward with a smile that was professional and entirely sincere. I introduced myself, heard my own voice, and understood how far the ground had shifted under all of us. They did not recognize me. They wanted a balcony. I found them a suite. I waived the fee on one condition that sounded like a perk: they would be assigned dedicated concierge service, and I would personally ensure their stay met the highest standards. Lilia beamed. David looked relieved and wary at once. I handed them keys to the Sunrise Suite and watched them drift toward the elevators, every inch the couple who believed the world existed to polish their mirrors. I went back to the bridge. James stood with his hands behind his back eyes on the harbor. "Well," he asked. "They are in place," I said, "and I am too." The horns sounded at 5:00 p.m., low and certain, and the lines slipped free. The first 3 days at sea unfolded with the precision of a script I had already memorized. As their concierge, I appeared when summoned, solved small inconveniences with courtesy, and kept the edge of my voice sharpened only in silence. Lilia treated me as I expected, snapping her fingers for fresh towels, complaining about the firmness of pillows demanding attention, as though it were her birthright. David said little. He avoided my eyes, existing in the shadow of his wife's demands. Watching them from this new vantage point, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The old Marlene would have crumbled under the weight of their disdain. The new Marlene simply observed, professional and steady, no longer tied to their approval. At night, I reviewed the surveillance feeds that monitored service standards in selected suites, a training tool we had disclosed in the fine print of contracts. Through those screens, I saw the raw version of their marriage. Lilia's contempt was constant, her voice sharp enough to cut. David flinched with every word. "You're a disappointment," she told him one evening, sneering at his shirt and his silence. "At least when your mother paid the bills, we had dignity." His weak reply, "She'll come around," stung less than I had feared. It sounded not like conviction, but like the tired script of a man too beaten to resist. By the third day, tension cracked in public. I was observing lunch service in the grand dining room when I heard her voice rise above the chatter. Lilia stood at her table berating a young server named Carmen, a woman from the Philippines who was sending money home to her parents and siblings. The offense was minor, a salad, dressed instead of served plain, but Lilia twisted it into insult. "People like you shouldn't be in hospitality." She snapped her words, slicing into the girl's dignity. Carmen's eyes shimmered with humiliation, and the room hushed with the uneasy fascination of witnesses to cruelty. I walked over every step calm, though fury burned through me. Lilia greeted me with relief, expecting an ally. "This waitress is incompetent. I want her fired." I looked at Carmen, then at Lilia, and kept my smile professional. "Actually, Carmen is one of our finest employees," I said. "She's received multiple commendations for her service." Lilia's eyes narrowed. "Are you contradicting me? I'm giving you accurate information." I answered, my tone edged with steel. The dining room leaned closer. Breaths caught. Then, from across the table, David's whisper shattered the silence. One word. "Mom." The room seemed to tilt. Lilia froze, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to reconcile what she'd heard. David stared at me as though I were a ghost. I turned my gaze on him and answered evenly. "Hello, David." "Hello, Lilia." Shock rippled across their faces, and then came humiliation, plain and raw, as the other guests realized what had been revealed. "You're supposed to be homeless!" Lilia stammered, her voice rising with panic. I held her eyes. "I was for 4 days. Then I found something better." David's voice cracked. "How are you here? How are you on this ship? I work here," I said. "In fact, I own part of it." The words struck like a hammer. Lilia staggered back, clutching the chair for balance. I turned to the dining room, apologizing with calm dignity for the disruption. "Family dynamics can be complicated," I said before addressing Carmen directly. "Thank you for your patience. You handled yourself with grace." The young woman's shoulders eased, gratitude flashing in her eyes. I left the table, letting them sit in the ruin of their certainty. But Lilia's voice followed, sharp and frantic. "Wait, we need to talk." I paused, tilting my head as though considering. About what? About demanding $50,000, about the slap, about throwing me out. My voice stayed even, but each phrase landed like a blow. David's face was ashen. Lilia grasped for dignity. We were under stress. Families forgive. I smiled faintly. "You never treated me as family." Then I told them where they could find me on stage tomorrow night, introduced not as their burden, but as vice president and partner. Their faces drained of color. That evening, in the quiet of the captain's quarters, James poured me a glass of wine and asked if I was all right. I thought carefully before answering. "Yes, it feels different now. I used to be terrified of losing them, but seeing them for who they really are, I feel free." He lifted his glass, and we toasted not revenge, but clarity. The next night, the theater filled with 1,500 passengers dressed in their finery. From the wings, I saw David and Lilia in the third row, stiff and uneasy, glancing toward the stage with desperation. James in his uniform welcomed the crowd with the authority of the sea. He introduced the executive chef, the cruise director, the hotel manager. Then his voice warmed, softened. Now I'd like you to meet someone very special. Our vice president of guest services, my business partner, and the woman I love, Marlene Morrison. I stepped onto the stage in a navy cocktail dress, the applause washing over me like a tide. My gaze found them instantly. Lilia's mouth fell open. David went pale as stone. James took my hand and kissed me softly, and the crowd cheered. Into the microphone, I spoke of hospitality, of belonging, of finding a home. Every word carried weight because it was not only a speech for the passengers, it was a statement to the two people in the third row who had once believed I was theirs to discard. When the show ended and passengers spilled into the lobby with champagne and chatter, I saw them weaving through the crowd toward me. David's shoulders slumped, his face desperate. Lilia's stride was sharp, her eyes darting, searching for a weakness. They stopped just short of the stage, and David spoke first, his voice thin against the murmur of guests. "Mom, please, we need to talk." I met his gaze evenly. "I'm sure you do. But tonight, I have responsibilities." I gestured lightly to the guests around us. "Business partner responsibilities?" The words stung him. I saw it in the twitch of his jaw. Lilia tried a different tactic, softening her voice. "Marlene, it was a misunderstanding. We were under pressure. We didn't mean the things we said." I tilted my head as though genuinely considering. Which things? The demand for $50,000? The slap across my face, throwing me out, or perhaps trying to humiliate a hard-working member of my staff yesterday. Each example struck them harder than the last. Guests nearby slowed their steps, their ears drawn to the rising tension. David's voice broke. "Please, Mom, you're still my mother." The words, once a chain, now carried no weight. "Am I?" I asked quietly. "When you stood by while your wife struck me, when you nodded as I was thrown from your home, you made your choice." Tears welled in his eyes. "I know. I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking." "You were thinking about yourself," I answered, still calm. "About avoiding conflict, about pleasing her." "You weren't thinking about me." Lilia interjected, her voice tight. "Families forgive, Marlene. That's what families do." I turned to her, my expression cool. "You never considered me family. I was an ATM, a convenience. When I was useful, I was tolerated. When I refused, I was disposable." Her mask slipped, desperation leaking through. "But you have so much now, and we're drowning. The house, the debts, we could lose everything." I nodded. "Yes, you could. And that is the consequence of your decisions. Bad investments, living beyond your means, assuming I would always bail you out. None of that is my responsibility anymore." James appeared at my side, his presence steady as the tide. His arm slipped around my waist, and he asked softly, "Everything all right here? Just catching up?" I replied. "And they were just leaving." Lilia started to protest, but I cut her off with a finality that silenced her. "Yes, you were." David reached for me one last time. His voice cracked with desperation. "I'll do anything. I'll leave her if I have to. Just please don't abandon me." The plea should have torn me apart, but I saw the hollowness in it, the empty promise of a man who had never learned to stand on his own. I pitied him, but pity no longer bound me. "David," I said gently, "I'm not abandoning you. You abandoned me when you turned your back 2 months ago. I am simply accepting the reality you created." His face crumpled, disbelief written in every line. "You can't mean that." "I can," I said, and my voice was steady. "And I do." I looked around at the people who now surrounded me, crew members who respected me, guests who applauded me, James who loved me without condition. "This is my family, now," I said quietly. The words landed heavier than any lecture, and I saw him stagger as though I had pushed him. Lilia, scrambling for leverage, threw out one last barb. "What about grandchildren? Don't you want that?" I shook my head, the answer arriving with startling clarity. "Any children you might raise would learn your values. I think they're better off without my influence." With that, I turned away. James guided me toward the exit, his arm strong around me. Behind us, voices rose, Lilia shrilled, David pleading, but I did not look back. On deck, the Caribbean night wrapped around us warm and forgiving. The water foamed below, glittering with phosphorescence. James pulled me close. "How do you feel?" I considered the question. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in my life, completely free." He studied me carefully. Any regrets? I thought of the house, of the photo albums, of the years I had poured into David. But the answer surprised even me. None. He kissed me under the stars, and I let the night air carry away the weight I had borne for decades. Freedom, I realized, is not always given. Sometimes it must be taken even from those you love most. The next morning at 9:00 a.m., David and Lilia left the ship at the first port of call, their luggage piled high, their faces tight with anger and shame. They did not return. As I watched their tender boat shrink into the distance, I felt not grief, but peace. The old Marlene would have chased them checkbook in hand. The new Marlene Morrison let them go. The Sea Star sailed on without them, its decks alive with laughter and music, carrying me toward a future of my own making. At 62, my real life was only just beginning. The days after their departure felt lighter, as if the ship itself had shed a weight. For the first time in years, I walked through my mornings without the echo of someone else's demands ringing in my ears. At 7:00 a.m., I joined crew briefings, taking notes, offering ideas, and earning nods of respect from people who had no history of me as a burden. By noon, I was meeting with department heads, learning the rhythm of a fleet that stretched across oceans. In the evenings, James and I dined together, sometimes in bustling restaurants at port, sometimes quietly in his quarters, overlooking the horizon. Slowly, naturally, the distance of 40 years shrank until it felt as though we had simply paused a conversation and were now picking it back up. Each day affirmed something I had long forgotten, that I was capable, worthy, and far stronger than the small life I had been confined to in my son's house. I was no longer the invisible guest tucked away in a corner bedroom. I was a partner, a leader, a woman who could hold her head high and be seen. The crew began to look to me for guidance, not because of James's influence, but because my words carried weight. I understood the pressures they faced, the exhaustion behind forced smiles, the way service can sometimes feel like servitude. And I used that understanding to make changes, policies that valued their well-being as much as the passengers. For the first time in decades, I was not just surviving. I was building something. Occasionally, whispers of David reached me. I heard through colleagues that their house was in foreclosure proceedings, that Lilia had left for her mother's home, that David was scrambling for work and money. Once he called again, but I did not answer. I no longer needed to hear excuses or pleas. I had given nearly 4 decades of my life to him, and in the end, he had chosen greed and convenience over love. That chapter was closed. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon and painted the waves gold, James asked me what I wanted next. I thought about it carefully. Everything I said. I want to see the places I dreamed of but never visited. I want to wake up without fear of someone else's temper. I want to choose my days, not have them chosen for me. He smiled, his hand covering mine on the railing. Then we'll do everything together. Months later, standing on another stage in another theater, I looked out at a sea of faces and told a different kind of story, not of betrayal, but of resilience. I spoke of how easily love can turn to entitlement, of how sacrifice must be balanced with self-respect, of how, even at 62, a new life can begin. The audience applauded, some with tears in their eyes, and in that moment, I knew that my story was no longer just mine. It was a reminder to anyone listening that worth is not determined by what others demand, but by what you claim for yourself. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, a horizon that promised both challenge and possibility. And as the ship pressed forward, I realized something profound. Freedom is not the absence of responsibility. It is the power to choose where you give your love, your time, and your loyalty. I had finally learned that lesson not through lectures or warnings, but through loss, betrayal, and ultimately the courage to begin again. If you've stayed with me until now, I want to thank you. My journey may have begun in heartbreak, but it led me to rediscovery, strength, and joy. And maybe in hearing it, you see a reflection of your own battles, your own choices, your own moments of courage waiting to rise. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place? I'd love to hear your thoughts.